All right, everyone. Hello. Thank you so much for coming to the Clinch Coalition's annual Lyme Naturalist Rally. We are virtual this year, but that doesn't mean that there is nothing to gain from having wonderful speakers come and present on topics they're passionate about. I do want to make sure that everyone knows the presenter has no conflicts of interest or disclosures to make regarding the content of this presentation, and it is going to be recorded. So by remaining here, you're giving your consent to be recorded, and if you do not consent to be recorded, you can disconnect at any time. Today, our 9 a.m. Speaker is Phil Meeks, speaking on ticks and chiggers. So thank you so much, Phil, and feel free to take it away.
Hey, thank you very much. I'll share my screen here and we'll get going. And thank you all very much for tuning in for a 9 a.m. presentation on ticks and chiggers. I know this is not the most sexy of topics. There are other topics I'd 10 times rather watch if I was a participant. But I think it is something important for people who spend time in the outdoors to be aware of. And we're going to talk about different species that may be encountered. We'll talk about different resources that you have, possible issues that may come from encounters with these particular creatures. And I have all week been saying chicks and tiggers, just goofing off. So I'm going to try not to say that today, but I may accidentally slip that in. But ticks and chiggers is what we're going to be discussing. Okay, am I? Okay, I was going to say it wasn't advancing, but when you're talking about ticks, there are almost 900 species globally. We have about 90 species in the US. Most of those people are never going to encounter this particular genus, for example, Ornithodoros. Those are soft-bodied ticks that spend their entire lives in caves, dens, and nests. So unless you're a spelunker and you routinely crawl through animal dens, you're probably never going to encounter those. But there are about 5 species that can be a problem that you may come into contact with, and we're going to talk about those this morning. The life cycle of a tick, they start out as an egg, and then they become a larva. And when I was growing up, we would talk about seed ticks like they were a separate species. But all ticks will go through this larval stage where they're seed ticks. They only have 6 legs at that point. Very small. They're sometimes called turkey mites, and they have some other names. Very, very tiny ticks, and you'll walk through an area and get your leg covered up with these, and they can kind of be a problem. They will advance into the nymph stage, then the adult stage, lay eggs, and start it all again. Now, what you may not realize is ticks only have a need for 3 blood meals during the course of their lifetime. Once they're a larvae, they will want to feed until they engorge themselves, and then they will advance into the nymph stage. As a nymph, they will look for a host and they'll engorge themselves on a blood meal, advance into the adult stage, and then they'll have a final and third blood meal as an adult before they reproduce. Generally speaking, the earlier stages in the life cycle, they want a smaller host. So the larvae or the seed tick stage, they want to be looking for things like mice, very small rodents. And then the nymphal stage, they would prefer to have a small mammal, something the size of a cat or squirrel. And then as adults, that's when they would look for the larger mammals, humans and deer. Now, that's not to say that larvae will not feed on humans, because they will, that we will do in a pinch, but they prefer to have small hosts when they're in their earlier life stages, and then advance to larger hosts later on. So once they reach that nymph stage, they're going to have 8 legs, but the larval stage, they will have 6. Again, 3 blood meals in the lifetime. What they do when they're searching for a host is they'll crawl up on a blade of grass, a plant, and they will outstretch their legs and they'll wait to come into contact with that host. There are some stories I hear of ticks dropping out of trees and that type of thing. That doesn't actually happen. Usually they're going to be about 3 feet off the ground, That's as high as they're going to get. That's where you're going to encounter the ticks is when you brush through with your pant legs. They don't jump, they don't drop out of trees. There has to be direct contact. And usually if you find a tick crawling on your neck, more than likely that tick has gotten onto your body about knee level and it's crawled up, but they don't drop out of trees. They don't jump. They're very hardy creatures. They can survive a couple years without eating. They like to stay at that 3-foot level, but when we go through a drought, they will move a little lower, place in the canopy where it's more humid, so they don't dry out. That can be a death sentence if they get too dry, so they have to maintain that moisture and that humidity. But typically 3 feet or less is where those ticks are going to be. And so that's important because if you're using any kind of repellent, you can realize that that your pants, that's going to be where that repellent is going to do the most good. So these pictures all come from the Maine Medical Center Research Institute, and I'm going to talk about 4 species first off that can have some impacts with humans that are in our area, and then we'll talk about a 5th species a little later on. But this first one, the American dog tick, this is by far the one that I encounter the most. If I'm out in a pasture doing a site visit or a soil sample, and I get back in my truck, I'll very often find this crawling on my legs. If I go on a hike, if I'm doing yard work around my home, this is the one that I encounter most in this area. The American dog tick, there are a couple of diseases that it can transmit. Rocky Mountain spotted fever is probably the most well-known. The tularemia, that one's listed, but that's one that any tick can transmit, as well as deer flies. And we'll talk a little bit about that one later on. But the American dog tick, your experiences may be different, but this is the one that I encounter the most, probably a good 90% of the time. Another dog tick, the brown dog tick, it can also transmit Rocky Mountain spotted fever. This is one of the ones that the first 4 that I speak about today. This is the one that likes humans the least. This one prefers, as the name would indicate, it prefers to feed on your dog. We as humans have these nice articulate fingers like raccoons, and we can scratch ticks off, we can pull them off, and so they prefer not to make use of humans as a blood meal if they can keep from it. But this one will, in a pinch, if it needs a blood meal, it will attach itself to a human. But more often than not, it prefers to be on a dog or some other similar size animal. You'll find this one in your house a lot. If you have a dog, you may find this one crawling in the dog bed, or if your dog's been rubbing against your leg, you could find this one crawling. But this is one that can also transmit Rocky Mountain spotted fever. This is the one that gets all the press. The blacklegged tick, it's also known as a deer tick. You can tell where the name comes from because those legs on this tick are very dark. It's has that brown and black contrast on its body. This is the one that transmits Lyme disease. There are some other diseases that it can transmit, but Lyme disease is what this one is famous for. This one is in this area. I wouldn't say that it's super common. It's not something that I encounter very often, but it is in our area. It is here in Southwest Virginia. And this is one, I grew up in Middle Tennessee, and I saw this one probably as often, if not more often, than that American dog tick. And then when I was an agent over in Whitley County, Kentucky, I saw this one about as often. So this was very common over there. According to the distribution maps, we do have that here in Southwest Virginia, but I don't know that I've encountered one since I've been here. And as I talk to people who spend time outdoors, very few people indicate to me that they have come into contact with the Lone Star tick, but it is here. And there's a sickness that it can convey to its host called STARI. And that's just Southern tick-associated rash illness. And it's very similar to Lyme disease, but it's transmitted by this particular one instead of the blacklegged tick. Another one that this particular tick is associated with is the alpha-gal syndrome, not so much a disease as a disorder. And what that is that allergy to red meat that you may have heard about. And then there's some other diseases that are associated with this one. But STARI, alpha-gal syndrome are probably the biggest ones of concern. If you go to the CDC website and you look at tick-borne illnesses, you'll get a mention of those 4 ticks I've just shown you, but there's some others that pop up a lot. The Rocky Mountain wood tick is mentioned. Nowhere near this area, so that's not one that we're going to dwell on and talk a lot about. The Gulf Coast tick is another one that can transmit some nasty diseases, but we don't have it, at least not established in this part of the world. A few years ago, there was a Gulf Coast tick that was confirmed in Wise County, but I think it was determined that somebody had transmitted it back on a dog after they'd gone to the beach, and it's not thought to be established around here. So this is not one we're going to worry a whole lot about. And then the Western black-legged tick, it can transmit the same diseases as our deer tick that we hear a lot about in the newspapers. So it's just in a different part of the country, very, very similar species, but can transmit those same diseases. But those are 3 species that you'll hear mentioned that we don't have to worry about as much here in southwestern Virginia. But if you travel, if you go on a vacation to any of these areas, and that may be one to keep in the back of your mind. So we'll talk about these 4 in particular, and then I'll give you a resource that will reference some other tick-borne illnesses, but Lyme, STARI, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and alpha-gal syndrome. And I know people who have 3 of these. I'm not aware of anybody who has STARI. There are probably a lot more than are being reported, but I know somebody. I know one person in particular who has had both Lyme and Rocky Mountain spotted fever. I know another person who has alpha-gal syndrome, and as I mentioned, that's an allergy to red meat. So he's doomed to an existence of chicken and fish because he allowed a Lone Star tick to take a bite out of him. Lyme disease, one of the first symptoms that you'll see with that is this characteristic bullseye spot. When you get that bite from a tick, you'll get that bullseye. Lyme disease has been confirmed in 46 states, and according to the Center for Disease Control, there are 30,000 cases of Lyme disease that are reported annually. However, it's believed that that number is closer to 300,000. These just don't get reported. We'll talk about some of the symptoms. They're very described as flu-like symptoms, and so they can be confused with a lot of other issues. But they're probably 300,000 cases a year, and that's pretty good estimate. An issue with Lyme disease is there can be some chronic issues, so you can have flare-up of Lyme once you have it for years to come. So that's a good motivation not to get it the first time. The black-legged tick that we have here, also known as the deer tick, that's the one that transmits Lyme disease here in southwestern Virginia. These are just some screenshots from the CDC website. It talks about the early signs and symptoms. Again, you can see that bullseye target spot. But these symptoms that are described as flu-like would include fever, chills, headache, fatigue, muscle aches. Those are pretty common with all of these tick-borne illnesses, with the exception of a couple. So as you can see, it's going to be hard to diagnose in a lot of cases that you have a tick-borne illness. So just take note, if you get a tick bite, just make a mental note that that has happened, so that when you're working with your doctor in the future, if you develop symptoms, you can at least say, hey, this tick-borne illness may be a part of that. So later on, if the Lyme disease is not treated, you can get some neck stiffness. You can get facial palsy, arthritis, heart palpitations, dizziness, nerve pain, just a lot of really bad symptoms that can develop if you don't get treatment for Lyme disease pretty quickly. STARI, as I said, it's very similar to Lyme disease. It has a similar type of bullseye target. It's a little more variable as far as that redness goes. Southern tick-associated rash illness, it's vectored by the Lone Star tick, the one that I showed you that has the white spot in the center of its back. That's who carries STARI. There are a couple of differences between STARI and Lyme disease. One of those is there's a shorter time frame from the time you're exposed until the time you develop symptoms. And another difference is the STARI does respond to antibiotics more quickly than Lyme disease does. So if you have the choice between STARI and Lyme disease, I would choose STARI because it's going to be a little easier to treat and it's not going to be as severe. However, just like with Lyme disease, you can have some chronic infection with STARI, and for years to come, you can continue to have flare-ups once you've been exposed to this the first time. Rocky Mountain spotted fever have a master gardener volunteer who's a retired pediatrician, and he tells me that when he was practicing, he saw Rocky Mountain spotted fever fairly frequently. It's something that does come up in Southwest Virginia, Eastern Kentucky pretty often. So that is here. And this was just a screenshot of those symptoms from the CDC website. And again, describe this as flu-like, fever, headache. You do get a rash with nausea, vomiting, stomach and muscle pain, and a lack of appetite. Rocky Mountain spotted fever is found in 40 states. There are no chronic cases, so that's a silver lining with the Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Once you get it treated, there have been no reports of any kind of chronic issues that come up with the Rocky Mountain spotted fever, as opposed to the Lyme and the STARI. If it's not treated, and this is rare, but there have been cases that have led to paralysis and amputations. So it is important to get that diagnosed and a treatment regime as quickly as possible. It's vectored by two of those ticks that we have here in our world, the American dog tick, the one I said is so common, and then the brown dog tick. And at least one extension resource that I consulted when I was putting this together did say that the Lone Star tick could also transmit Rocky Mountain spotted fever, but none of the other resources have mentioned that. But definitely the American dog tick and the brown dog tick can vector Rocky Mountain spotted fever. The alpha-gal syndrome, that's the red meat allergy. And again, it's not so much a disease as a disorder that's passed through a sugar molecule that's in the tick's saliva. So the Lone Star tick bites you, transmits this sugar molecule into your blood system, and then all of a sudden you're allergic to red meat. That can endure for years. I think there are cases where people get over the red meat allergy. But again, the only tick associated with the alpha-gal syndrome is the Lone Star tick. This is a resource that I think it would be good for a lot of outdoors people to either bookmark on their computer or maybe even print off a good color copy and put in a binder just for future reference. Tick-borne diseases of the United States, you can go to the CDC website and you can download a PDF of this. Has some great information on identification, help you identify these different ticks. And then there's an entire section devoted to each of these common diseases that you see here. Some of those that we haven't talked about, some that are not super common, but maybe things to keep in mind. But again, just go to the CDC website and you can download this entire reference and have it at your fingertips. I want to mention, because this comes up in extension a lot, is this new exotic tick that we have in this area, the Asian longhorn tick. We went for about 100 years without introducing any invasive ticks to the United States, as far as anybody knows. And then all of a sudden in New Jersey in 2017, this Asian longhorn tick was found, gets its name. If you look at those front legs, how long those are, that's where the name comes from. But from New Jersey, it just spread, and it is in Southwest Virginia now. It's one of the issues with the Asian longhorn tick is they exhibit parthenogenesis, which means that they can reproduce without a male. And last I heard, there had been no male Asian longhorn ticks yet found in the United States. So all the reproduction is happening through parthenogenesis by the females. What that means is in a very short period of time, there can be thousands of ticks that develop once they attach to a host. And this is a particular problem with livestock producers and pet owners. Not so much with humans, although I'm sure they would bite a human. It's really a problem with livestock and pets. There have been some cases here in Virginia where somebody notices that their calves or their sheep are very slow moving and seem less than healthy. And upon closer inspection, they found thousands of these ticks attached to the animals. So livestock and pets, that's what you got to be worried about. The tularemia is a disease that is transmitted by the Asian longhorn tick, but it only impacts cattle. And what that is, it's anemia in the cattle. And so the cattle will get very, very lethargic, just loss of appetite. There have been some producers that have lost multiple head of cattle because of this tick, but just one to be aware of, especially as you inspect your pets or if you have livestock, just be aware of this one, the Asian longhorn tick. Now moving into a different critter, the chiggers. Chiggers are the larval stage of several mite species. So a chigger in Texas is going to be a different species than a chigger in Virginia. So there are different mite species that during the larval stage, once they come out of the egg, that's when they're a problem. They're only parasitic in the immature stage. Once these reach adulthood, they don't feed on a living host. They eat a lot of decaying plant matter, that kind of thing. So they're only parasitic in their immature stage, in their larval stage. Just like with some of these ticks we talked about, humans aren't their first choice. They'd much rather feed on a mouse or a squirrel or something small if they can, but they will make a meal of a human if a human happens by. Just like with ticks, there's some folklore that goes along with chiggers. It's just not true. The chiggers don't burrow into your skin. I've had people swear to me that the chiggers burrowed beneath the skin and they pulled them out with tweezers, but they don't do that. They don't go into your skin. And they also don't feed on blood. So that makes them a little different than the ticks. What they do is they will inject an enzyme, and that enzyme will cause your skin cells to dissolve, cause those skin cells to liquefy, sort of like a skin milkshake. And then that's what they will feed on, is that liquefied skin. They're not interested in blood. They're interested in your dissolved skin. And that enzyme is what causes that crazy itching. And just like with the ticks, chiggers will tend to go to places where the skin is very thin and where maybe you have tight clothing around it. So your socks, your ankles, that's where you'll get covered up with chiggers. If you're wearing a belt around your waistline, around the groin area, your hair, your armpits, those are normally where you're going to find chiggers, as well as some of the ticks. But chiggers are only drinking your liquefied skin cell. They're not going after the blood. Chiggers have a temperature range where they're just not a problem anymore. This morning, if you had gone out, I think it's 44 degrees in Pound. If I'd gone outside barefooted and walked through chigger habitat, I probably wouldn't have had any problem at all. And then, of course, if it gets really hot, up above 99 degrees, chiggers won't be a problem. But that 60 to 99 degree range is when you're going to encounter chiggers. And personally, I encounter them in the fall much more often than I do in other times of the year. Prevention, the ace in the hole for preventing ticks and chiggers is going to be a product that has 20 to 30% DEET. Something like off. But the issue with DEET is there are some people who have allergies. And so a good second choice is picaridin. Picaridin is derived from a pepper. And there has been some research done with the effectiveness of picaridin and most products will give a solid 4 to 8 hours of protection. So it's a great second choice to DEET, maybe a little more gentle, especially if you have some DEET allergies. Oil of lemon eucalyptus is one. These get more and more what we might call organic. So that's one that does have some potential. Citronella can give you a little protection against ticks and chiggers. Another really good option if you're, for example, a landscaper, or you're somebody who maybe you're doing some research and thick brush, you can treat your clothing with permethrin, and that's very effective. Permethrin's pretty strong stuff, so you don't want to apply it to your skin, but there are products you can get. You can spray your pants and shirt and your hat, put it in a bag and let it soak in, and then you're protected. There are also clothes that can be ordered that are pre-treated with permethrin, and from what I've read, they stay effective for up to 70, 80 washings. So clothing treated with permethrin is another good all-day option. Removing the tick. This is first aid that has changed some over the years. I remember when I was in Boy Scouts, they would say they coat the tick with Vaseline or some kind of oil to smother it, and then it would back out. That's not recommended anymore, because once you smother that tick, it's going to regurgitate a lot of the saliva and the things in its body back into your bloodstream. So you don't want to do that. The best removal strategy is some nice tweezers. Grip that tick as close to your skin as you possibly can, and then give a nice, steady, slow pull to remove it and detach it. You don't want to hold a lighter to it or a burnt match. You don't want to cover it with any kind of oil or lotion. Just pull it out of there. If you have a weedy yard, you want to evaluate, a good way to do that is take a 3x3 square of white cotton or flannel, just drag it through the weeds, and then you can just pick those off and get them identified one by one, and that's going to give you some idea of what species you have close by. Chris Allgaier, the president of the Untitled Chapter Virginia Master Naturalist, turned me on to this app. There's one called the Tick app. It's a good one for tracking different species, for researchers to be able to look in and see that there's a record of a Gulf Coast tick in Wise County, for instance. So that's a good one to put on your phone. iNaturalist can help with ID if you can get a good enough picture. I will plug the extension offices. That's something that we can do. If you find a tick and you want to know what species it is, you can bring it by my office, and I can get a good a USB microscope picture and send it to our insect lab up at Virginia Tech, and get you an answer pretty quickly as to what you're dealing with. There are a couple of places where you can actually send ticks and they will do a pathogen evaluation. One of those is the UMass Amherst Lab for Medical Zoology, as well as Old Dominion University here in Virginia. You can collect that tick, put it in a vial of alcohol, and ship it to the lab. There are some other places that will do that too. These two I know will evaluate for 20 different pathogens. And so if you, I had a coworker a few years ago, her toddler had a tick attached, and she sent that to the lab just to make sure there were no pathogens that her toddler could have gotten exposed to. The cost is usually around $50 to get that evaluation done. There have been some cases where a researcher is offering that for free because they're looking for something in particular. But if you do a little research, you'll find these labs that can do the evaluations for you and see what kind of pathogen loads are in the ticks that you collect. And that's the end of my presentation. This is my contact information. If you don't have questions today, if you run into a tick issue later on that we can try to help you with, you can email me or give me a call, and I'll try to get you an answer. But I'm going to stop sharing now, and if there are any questions, I will make an attempt to answer those.
Thank you so much, Phil, for your your presentation. Jerry, I see you raised your hand. You guys can also ask your questions if you hit the Q&A box. Jerry, if you want to go ahead and speak, you're more than welcome to.
I just wonder how much effort our country is making in trying to keep out things like that Asian tick. And, I know of several other things that, are coming into our country. And in contrast, I know New Zealand really is careful. Can you give me any discussion on how much our government is working to keep out things, invasive species and disasters like these ticks?
Well, I can't say a lot. I know that there are efforts being made. I know that there's so much international travel now. There's so much international trade. It's harder and harder to keep things out. A lot of things are introduced because they think they're a good idea. We talk about kudzu, and we could talk about multiflora rose, and we could talk about Johnson grass. All of those were introduced on purpose. There's not as much of that kind of thing anymore, but there are a lot of issues where things are coming in that, and there are, I'm not super familiar with what the regulations are. If I'm carrying a pet from another nation, I don't know if that's inspected. I don't know what goes into that, but it would be very easy, I can see, for a tick to find its way into the country. It can be attached to a human, can be attached to a pet. So it's a nearly impossible task, but I know there are efforts being made to keep those things from happening. And that doesn't answer your question thoroughly, but that's about as far as I can answer.
Thank you.
And then we do have a question. If you want to look, Phil, at the question and answer section from Troy Boring, would you like to read that out?
Okay. Hey, Adam. You got a bullseye spot with American dog tick. The Rocky Mountain spotted fever does cause a rash, and so it would be possible that that rash could have a bullseye appearance. Let's see, got a bite in the ear, treated it like Lyme, but I'm 95% certain it was the American dog tick. If it's the American dog tick, then more than likely I would look at Rocky Mountain spotted fever.
Okay, then we have a question from Sylvia. Tick populations seem much higher generally now than previously. They certainly are in my area compared to several decades ago. Here, the increased deer population is the largest apparent change. Are the number as well as the variety of ticks increasing? And if so, what practices might counter that?
Well, I think increased animal populations, mammal populations would certainly contribute to that. I haven't seen any figures that would make me think that the tick populations are generally higher than they have been in the past. I remember being a kid in Middle Tennessee, I was more or less feral, and that my parents would put me out in the morning, and I would be out all day, and I would encounter a lot of ticks, a lot more ticks then, but I was more likely to go crawling through brush and be wading through weeds all day. So I haven't seen anything that indicates that populations are actually higher, but definitely if you have deer on properties where you didn't have deer 20 years ago, then that would certainly contribute to a higher tick population in that particular spot. Asking what practices might counter that. Deer fencing would be, I know gardeners, a lot of our gardeners use deer fencing. It's more to keep the deers from feeding on the plants, but it would also have a additional benefit of keeping the tick population down. You hear a lot of things about people getting certain types of livestock to cut back on ticks, such as guineas. I've heard the argument that guineas will keep your tick populations down. I don't know how much of that's folklore. I know they will eat ticks. I know possums will eat a lot of ticks. So there are some animals that can work to the advantage of bringing the tick populations down, but I don't know if that's always going to be a practical thing. I have been in a situation before where I had toddlers and we had a heavy tick load one year. We did have to invest in a spray and spray the yard just so the kids would have a place that they could play and not get covered up with ticks. So there are some products, over-the-counter products that you could use. A lot of people don't like to use chemicals around the home, and I understand that. I don't either, but something like that may be worth looking at. Also, of course, keeping vegetation down, keeping vegetation short around your home, around areas where you're going to be, that's going to cut back on your populations quite a bit.
Excellent. Any final questions for Phil from anyone?
I had one other comment.
Yes, ma'am.
Where I grew up in Patrick County at Meadows-Adan, large family, big farms. We were all over the place. In my 18 years there, not one tick. And now you really have to be careful. I don't know what all kinds are there, but there are times when the grass, the hay, they're all over it, and you can really get covered. So there's a big difference on that mountaintop.
Right. And you mentioned that there are more deer now than there
gosh.
were.
There were no deer. There were no deer when I was young.
Right.
At all while I was there, and farming.
Right.
The deer came in and so on, and they're very thick now. The deer are. But
Yes,
Phil, I'll tell you one other thing.
Okay.
They're seeing the lynx over there.
Oh, are they?
Yes,
Nice.
and they've seen them over in Kentucky, and I saw a picture of it. I got a degree in biology, so I guess I know those people say they know it's not a bobcat,
Right.
That's anyway, cool. Things are changing.
Those are pretty animals for sure.
Yeah, and good weight because I think they are taking the deer. Yeah.
And
thank you,
Adam. Thank you. And Adam was talking about tick predators, possums. Yeah, I've read that possums are excellent tick predators. Guineas. I've known people who've bought guineas just to keep the tick populations down. Of course, there are some issues with guineas too. They're a little bit loud. So if you have neighbors close by, they may prefer that you have ticks as opposed to guineas, but both of those have been listed as tick predators. Another thing too is ticks will tend to be around areas where small mammals like to feed. So if you have berry patches, like say if you have blueberries in your landscaping right up next to your house, you're going to just be inviting the possibility of having ticks in the back door. So some of those things you might think about locating a reasonable distance from your front door so that you don't have as many ticks up close.
Excellent. Well, thank you again, Phil. I believe that's everyone's final questions. Going once, going twice. We really appreciate you coming and speaking on ticks and chiggers. I certainly learned a lot, and I believe everyone who was in attendance can agree. There's a lot that I didn't even really understand or know about ticks. So thank you.
Oh, glad to do it, and hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Looks like some great presenters coming up. Adam was asking about Queen Anne's lace. It's called chiggerweed. I've heard people call Queen Anne's lace chiggerweed, and I've had people swear to me that they've gotten chiggers by brushing against the Queen Anne's lace. I haven't seen anything that, beyond the shadow of a doubt, says that's 100% actual, though. So it may be more myth. I'm sure Chigger would dig into that Queen Anne's lace flower and be happy to be in there, but I don't know if that's 100% all the time.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you everybody for joining us for our first presentation today. If you would like to attend the other presentations, our schedule is here. Our next speaker will be Austin Counts at 11 a.m. speaking on solar energy for Southwest Virginia. The live streaming on Facebook and the recording will be paused, but the waiting room will remain open for participants and attendees to join again. We will see you all at 11 a.m. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.